Thanks for having me. My name is Amber, and I'm the Stewardship Project Manager at Huron Pines. I've worked for Huron Pines for 3 years, but prior to that, I got my bachelor's in environmental science from Ferris State University. I'm originally from Metro Detroit, and then I got my master's at Central Michigan University in conservation biology, and then made my way up north to work for Huron Pines. I've done a lot of different conservation and natural resources jobs in my lifetime, and including working at Hammond Bay Biological Station, controlling invasive sea lamprey, and working at small nature centers around the state. But now my main role is invasive species management and habitat restoration in the 5 counties of Northeast Michigan that touch Lake Huron. And then I have a counterpart in Gaylord, which we'll talk about later, who covers the 6 interior counties of Northeast Michigan, doing very similar invasive species activities. So thanks for having me today. And I'm just going to give you, excuse me, sort of a broad overview of how we are working in the region to manage invasive species, what an invasive species is, some examples and the impacts that they cause to our natural resources, and talk about some of the projects we have going on in the Alpena area. So if you're not familiar, Huron Pines is a nonprofit conservation organization. We have an office in Alpena and an office in Gaylord. And on the map, you can see we basically do lots of different projects in that dark green section of Northeast Michigan. Some of our work even goes into the eastern UP and the Saginaw Bay sometimes. So we do lots of different activities. I do invasive species management, but I have colleagues that do dam removals, community science programs, education and outreach events, preserve management, all sorts of activities. We're a very diverse nonprofit, and our main goal is to conserve and enhance northern Michigan's natural resources so we can ensure healthy water, protected places, and vibrant communities. And we really try to dig deep into our communities to get people engaged and empowered to do good conservation work. So today we'll talk about the definition of an invasive species. The state actually has a formal definition and does a lot of work related to invasive species. We'll talk about invasive species management areas, which are organizations that exist to manage invasive species in different geographic locations across the state. We'll talk about different management techniques, some habitat restoration projects we're working on, and then talk about how maybe you could get involved if you were interested in some of our upcoming Huron Pines events. So, an invasive species is one that is not native and whose introduction causes harm or is likely to cause harm to Michigan's economy, environment, or human health. And that is a direct quote from the Michigan Invasive Species Program, which is administered through the DNR. Invasive species, the definition has 2 very important parts that both need to be true in order for something to be considered an invasive species, and that is, 1, it is not native, so it was not here originally, it did not evolve into our natural ecosystems, it was brought over somehow. There's lots of different ways that invasive species can be transported, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And the second important part of that definition is that it causes harm or is likely to cause harm. So that can be anything from killing fish like sea lamprey do, or causing burns and rashes, or being inedible to cattle. There's lots of different things, infrastructure damage. There's lots of different ways that you can quantify harm, but both of those things need to be true, not native and causes harm. So invasive species are really good at crowding out native plant and animal species, and they do not provide good cover or food sources for our native wildlife and pollinators. They oftentimes disrupt natural ecosystem processes. So some species are really good at changing the soil composition or hydrology. Some impact the food web because they're displacing good food sources for wildlife and pollinators. They can oftentimes change how wetlands are functioning and filtering water. Lots of different natural ecosystem disruptions. Some of them are toxic to humans or animals. Some are really good at reducing property values or damaging property. There's a species that we manage in many places called Japanese knotweed. I'm not going to dive super deep into specific species, but that one is really notorious for growing through foundations, concrete, septic systems. So there are invasive species that are very damaging to infrastructure. And overall, a lot of them just decrease the enjoyment of the outdoors. Some of them block recreation access, so places you've normally been able to kayak maybe are now full of invasive species, making it more difficult. Some of them just degrade the aesthetics of natural areas. You don't want to go out and see a giant patch of Phragmites on your shoreline instead of the beautiful Lake Huron or whatever body of water you may be recreating on. And some just overall decrease native sighting or sightings of native species. So if you're a bird watcher, a fisherman, a hunter, invasive species impact you too, because you will not see as many good things as you're used to seeing when there's a lot of invasive species present in an area. So a lot of times when people think of invasive plants, you have maybe very specific pictures in your mind. Maybe you think of zebra mussels, maybe you think of Phragmites, but it's important to note that invasive species can be any sort of living organism: birds, fungi, insects, invertebrates, fish, plants. A whole gamut of living organisms can be invasive species. So here's a few invasive species that maybe you aren't familiar with or are not as prevalent in the region sometimes. So we have a mute swan. Mute swans are invasive birds. Oak wilt is the picture next to the mute swan. Asian longhorned beetle is one of our watch list species. It's not currently in the state of Michigan, but they're watching for it. And then red swamp crayfish is prevalent in southwest Michigan. What I do for a living mostly revolves around invasive plants. There's a lot less logistics involved with plants. They stay in the same relative location compared to an animal or an invertebrate. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment sometimes. Like if you're trapping crayfish, you need traps and you need all sorts of permits that, and we have lots of permits too, don't get me wrong, but it's just something nice about working with stationary plants comparatively. So most of what our work at Huron Pines revolves around are these plant species. Can you tell us? Sure. The top left corner is garlic mustard, which is pretty prevalent at this time of year. It has scalloped leaves with little white flowers, and if you crush the leaves, they literally smell like garlic, and it's edible, which is kind of fun. The purple flower is called purple loosestrife. That is an aquatic flowering plant that you often see in July and August. That bright purple you see in all the ditches and along shorelines is purple loosestrife. The bottom left species is a cultivated variety of Japanese barberry, which they say has sterile fruit and is safe to put in landscaping, but we find it all over the place because the birds move it around. So we're not so sure that the berries are as sterile as they proclaim to be. And then Phragmites is the tall grass. You can kind of see the dog swimming for scale. It's very tall. It has very fluffy seed heads, and it's pretty much going to grow in like wetter areas, shorelines, ditches, that sort of thing. So those are pretty common ones that we are managing around the region.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mute swan.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them.
Yes, the USDA removes the mute swans, especially from like Besser Lake and the Alpena Wildlife Sanctuary, because they limit native swans and other waterfowl's ability to reproduce successfully. So they get rid of them. I don't know what get rid of necessarily entails. I'll let you use your imaginations for that, but
mm-hmm. We had a few trumpeters.
Oh, yes.
So that was exciting to see. Two of them came. I don't know where they are.
Yes.
There's not too many mutes, but at least they're staying here now.
Once the trumpeters can become established, they're pretty good at keeping the mutes away, but the mutes were here for so long in such big numbers. They are very mean. They are very mean. So yeah, they're a nuisance. They also eat a ton of vegetation compared to our native swans. Like they will decimate the vegetation in like water bodies comparatively. So just some other definitions just to really grasp and understand what an invasive species is. So a native species is an organism that has developed within a particular ecosystem or region for hundreds or thousands of years, and it's part of the natural ecology of the area. So some examples would be like red maple, poison ivy, Michigan lily. I could name like thousands and thousands of native plants. There's also what's called non-native species, and these are organisms that are introduced to a new area or habitat with human assistance, whether it's unintentional or intentional, and they're going to areas where they're not previously known to exist. So just because something's non-native doesn't necessarily mean it's invasive, because there are plenty of non-native species that don't cause harm. Tulips. It's a lot of our crop species we brought from different areas of the world to sustain our livelihoods. And then sometimes invasive species are, well, sometimes non-native species are invasive, which is why autumn olive is listed. But anyways, an invasive species is always non-native, but a non-native species is not always invasive. I know it's a little very wordy, but an invasive species is never a native species. And so here's this fun Venn diagram I have that showcases how some things can be not native to the Midwest, and some native species can cause harm, but only the ones that do both things are considered invasive. So as we talked about earlier, things like tulips and peonies and other, species might not be native, but we need them a lot of times for food, or they're very aesthetically beautiful and they're not causing harm. Some species like poison ivy, ragweed, even though they are a nuisance, they are native and they have benefit to wildlife, even if they're a pain for us. They still have value. And then that intersection, things like bush honeysuckle, purple loosestrife, reed canary grass, lots of different invasive species. They're bridging that gap between non-native and also causing harm.
You said poison ivy is
Native,
but
a nuisance.
yeah, but you said it was useful or something.
Yeah, wildlife will eat the fruit that it produces. Like turkeys really like poison ivy, like berries and fruit. If it is able to, have the right conditions and grow unencumbered by other species, maybe nibbling on it or us removing it, it does produce fruit that wildlife eats. And it produces cover and habitat for lots of insects and stuff too. As I mentioned before, I do work for Huron Pines, but Huron Pines is a member of invasive species management areas. So the DNR gives us grant funding to support different groups all over the state to just exist and do invasive species related activities. So this is a map that points out how every county in the state of Michigan is actually part of one of these invasive species management units. We all have different acronyms that we use, but essentially we all operate very similarly. We get state funding from the DNR to do different sort of invasive species related activities. Some organizations more focus on outreach, some do management and outreach. It's a very broad spectrum of activities, but the main thing I like to point out is that if you aren't from the area, maybe this is like more of a seasonal location you live in, your home area also has someone like Huron Pines doing similar work, and you may not know about it. So you can see in my counties, they are in orange in the top right corner of Michigan, the east corner of Michigan. And I also just like to point out how one of our invasive species areas actually covers 3 counties in Wisconsin too, which is just kind of unique. There's around 22 of us, and we meet regularly with each other to talk about all sorts of different state invasive species things. We talk about how we're managing things. We talk about what's up and coming in the invasive species world. We talk about outreach, like we meet a few times a year all together and just discuss how we're all doing and what we're working on in our areas to kind of get ideas and inspire each other to keep doing good work. So it's really fun to be part of a network like that.
The color to me, associated with blue and orange.
Yeah.
What's that mean?
It means we're two different organizations. So I only cover those 5 counties, but we get additional funding from we used to be one big area, but having like one pot of money for 12 counties or 11 counties was like not very equitable compared to especially some that are only like 1 or 2 or 3 counties. So we split around 2019 and 2020 so that the DNR could give us a little extra funding to better support our 11 counties separately. So, and our habitats are really different. So the invasive species we see, there's a lot of overlap, but just what I see in my 5 counties is a little different than what is in the inner counties. The habitats are a little different. We have different invasive species concerns comparatively. So yeah, we just split so that we could provide more resources to our areas independently. So yeah, every section of colors is a different invasive species organization. So my neck of the woods is called the Huron Coastal Invasive Species Network, and then those 6 inner counties is called the Huron Heartland Invasive Species Network, and we all exist underneath the umbrella of Huron Pines. But I'd just like to point out that these are sort of like distinct areas that we work in through funding from the state. As I mentioned, SISMAs can do different things. SISMA is kind of the most common acronym we use to describe these invasive species management organizations. We do a lot of different things as Huron Pines. We have lots of educational materials. I brought some up on this table. If you want to take any home with you, you're welcome to. We do lots of different trainings every year. This year we're doing a woody invasive shrub removal workshop where participants will learn how to manage things like autumn olive and honeysuckle on their properties. We also can provide expertise on invasive species and sometimes native species identification. We provide free site visits to landowners interested in learning about invasive species that might be on their properties. We can provide management recommendations and assist with management in a lot of scenarios. We do lots of treatments on public and private lands, and we also provide lots of invasive species volunteer opportunities. We have some at Cheboygan State Park this summer to remove spotted knapweed, which I will get to in a bit. This is probably the most used graphic by invasive species managers because it does a really great job of explaining how invasive species work and how resources get dedicated to different species over time. So if you look at this graph, the best time to manage invasive species is to prevent them from even getting here in the first place. A lot of time that's pretty out of our control because plants and animals have their own, agendas. A lot of times it's accidental. We try our best, but prevention is the best. We can keep things from getting here. That's ideal. It keeps them from spreading. If an invasive species is introduced, but it's in a small number, and it's relatively new to the area, we can oftentimes eradicate it from the region. But as it grows in numbers and reproduces and distributes itself across the landscape, then sometimes a more realistic management is to contain it, keep it from spreading. We can't get rid of it, but we can focus our efforts in different places to keep it at bay for those places. And then there's a lot of things that we have been here for a very long time, and it's very it's very expensive and would take a lot of time and energy to manage. So there's a lot of prioritization that we have to do with our limited resources to decide, how are we managing invasive species on the landscape. And then I also just like to point out that usually public awareness typically begins when a species is already pretty moderately present in the region, because now folks are noticing like, hey, this plant never used to be here, but now I'm seeing a lot of it. So that's just sort of a byproduct of finally having enough to notice the impacts and the difference it's making. Yeah, so this is what we call the invasion curve. So, like I said, there's certain invasive species that are not as prevalent in the region and that have sort of more severe impacts a lot of times to the environment or humans. So we call these sort of our high priority invasive species. These are a few of the high priority invasive species in the region that we try to tackle as often as we can. You know, we do have limited resources and staff to dedicate to it, and we cover a large geographic area, but we do really try our best to manage as many populations of these invasive species as we possibly can fit in our schedule. So,
eradication there, the sanctuary.
Yeah. Yeah, we used to do lots of we do lots of hand pulling of it at the kayak launch. Unfortunately, the frog bit is pretty much, you know, as far upstream as Hillman, and it's in Fletcher Pond and Lake Winya. So it's just a large problem. But it is very sporadic in our other counties that we work in. So we're trying to eradicate it from those counties. And then for Alpena and the Thunder Bay River, we're really trying to like keep it as contained as we possibly can. So that's sort of our frog bit strategy. But yes, we've done volunteer events, and I'm on the Alpena Wildlife Sanctuary board for the city. So I work very closely with lots of folks in that area to do invasive species removal, but also just like other things.
Another question has in the past to put in mandatory boat washing stations at sites.
Yes, the city, the new parks director and harbor master for the city of Alpena, relatively new. His name's Kevin, and he is working to get grant money from the state to install a boat cleaning station at the kayak launch at Duck Park, but also hopefully the marina. A lot of times boat launches don't tend to have cleaning equipment, so the best thing that you could do in those scenarios is take your boat like to a car wash to get rid of it. But the city is trying to get some more infrastructure in place to help clean off boats, and the DNR sort of has a mobile boat wash stations that they take different places around the state, but having permanent facilities for that would be more ideal, yes.
How prevalent solar in those other states? It's mandatory. But publicly, we had them coming in and we tried to get, you know, goes with the zebra mussels and that kind of stuff. Demonstrate it and then volunteer it, but we never able to make it stay there.
Yeah, it's hard because there's also people, since it's not like the law only requires that you remove plant material and things from your boats, and don't, if you're driving like down the road and you have plants hanging off your boat motor, that is illegal, like an illegal thing that conservation officers and police can issue tickets for. But like getting people to comply to all the boat cleaning regulations is incredibly difficult. But I would do like to point out that conservation officers do get a set portion of their time going to making sure people are following like those sorts of laws and like checking, boating licenses and making sure people are cleaning and that sort of thing. And like, it's not a big portion of their time, but it is part of their time. All right. And then on the other side of things, we also have species that are very widespread all over the state and a lot of times all over the United States. And so some examples of those are on the screen. And these are species that we only really manage in really, really ecologically valuable habitats. Places like Nagogon State Park that are undisturbed for the most part, not going to be developed. They have a lot of threatened, endangered, or rare species that live there that we're trying to keep their habitats nice. Not to say we wouldn't, remove these species from other places, but oftentimes we try to focus most of our efforts for these species in those really nice, natural, big habitats so that we can keep them beneficial for our native species. So there's lots of different types of invasive species management. You can manually or mechanically remove species, which is just using your hands or tools. You can use chemicals, herbicide, pesticide to manage invasive species. And there's also biological controls sometimes where you're using one species to target another species. So that picture is a picture of, it's called the Galarusula beetle, or more commonly known as the purple loosestrife beetle. And this is a beetle that they have found, and biological control takes decades of testing before they are confident enough to release other species that may not be native to the region to manage invasive species. But the Galarusula beetle is sort of the best success story we have currently for a beetle that only eats purple loosestrife. And if there's enough purple loosestrife in a region and you release the beetles over time, they'll kind of just eat it to death, which is really nice. And they do not eat our native flowers or loosestrife species. And they did lots of testing to make sure that that was true. But this is something that we deploy in places with an unmanageable amount of purple loosestrife. It does take several years to start seeing the impacts that the beetles are having, but they do a pretty good job over time, and it's better than doing nothing. So that's an example. Whoop.
Question on the manual removal.
Yep.
I've come back to our property, we have 180 acres, and I was shocked how, in the district, foresters come out. How, if you go back to the other chart there, how many of those plants have taken over. It's so like the autumn olive, you have to actually take the root out of the ground, or can you cut them off? And I know my field is completely covered with spotted knapweed and thistle.
Yeah, so
that's recommended chemicals for that, but like
yeah, for the autumn olive, if it's young or if you have a tractor, you can kind of rip them out of the ground, and if you get most of the roots, it will not regrow. Most of the time, people don't have a tractor, or it's on such a large scale that it would be a little hard to pull them all out of the ground. So we often recommend doing what's called a cut stump method, which is a combination of cutting it, but then applying herbicide just to the stump to kill the roots in the ground when you can't remove them fully. Because if you just cut it and don't do anything, it will regrow, and a lot of times they get angrier when they get more robust when you cut them and let them regrow. So
yeah, we have a lot of those and I don't recognize them until they flower.
It is very widespread. Unfortunately, autumn olive in the 70s and 80s was very widely promoted and given away for free by different agencies and conservation districts. They didn't know any better. It's not their fault. Because they were like, it has berries for wildlife. Deer won't eat the trees. They can create like these lovely windbreaks and natural fences. Like, plant it everywhere. Here you go. Here's like a bunch to put on your property. And now, several decades later, we realized that that was a big mistake. And there's actually study plots in our region of Michigan where different agencies tested out how autumn olive grew. They planted rows of it. And that is one of the reasons why it's a bigger problem sometimes in our region, because they just had some of these areas that were test plots long ago. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that, unfortunately. So the management methods we choose depend on lots of different things. It depends on the actual species itself, how it grows, what is its biology, and it depends on the abundance of the species. Also, time of year is really important to consider. What sort of habitat you're in is important, and then what is our funding and equipment, and what are the safety concerns? All of these go into our thought process when we're deciding how we want to manage an invasive species. So here's some photos of our seasonal employees that we have using different management tactics. So the photo on the left, our crew member Braden manually pulled this giant mullein out of the ground, and it's pretty easy to pull a mullein out of the ground. Would I want to pull like 1,000 of them out of the ground? No, but I could if I wanted to. And then there's some species that the way that they grow and the way that they have developed to live, just like the only viable option really if we want to remove them from the landscape is herbicide use. So that is a photo of one of our employees wearing an herbicide backpack to manage, I believe, purple loosestrife in a Great Lakes fen. So I just like to point out that, as I said, many invasive species, literally the only viable option to manage them is to use herbicide, but this is strictly regulated by the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development and EGLE. And it requires extensive training and permits and equipment to use herbicide, especially when we're working on or near water or in areas with sensitive habitat or sensitive species. All of the treatments that Huron Pines does are performed by registered pesticide applicators, and we follow all state and federal laws regarding the use of herbicides. And we also always wear our proper personal protective equipment. We take herbicide application very seriously, and we really try to think really ethically about our use of it. We try to use methods that reduce non-target impacts. So we try to minimize any other plants in the area or other species in the area. We don't want to harm them as much as possible. So that's why that's a great segue into what we were talking about with autumn olive. If you have a tree, of autumn olive this big, I don't want to take my backpack and go like this and just spray it, because it's going to get on the grass, it's going to get on other plants in the region. So instead of doing those sorts of things, we use a different tactic where we cut it and then we're only putting a small amount of herbicide on the stump to reduce its impact. So those are the sorts of thought processes we go through when we decide that herbicide is our best option. And I just really like to emphasize that we do lots of steps to reduce non-target impacts. And then oftentimes when an invasive species is removed from an area, we can do some restoration to make sure that that habitat is resilient, is biodiverse, and it will not be susceptible to future invasions. If you leave a blank canvas after you treat invasive species, it's sort of an open invite for more invasive species to recolonize it. But if you restore that area with some beneficial native species, that reduces that likelihood very much. So, yes.
What do you do with, for example, the olive stuff that you cut down? Where do you take it, or what do you do with it?
It kind of depends. We don't do that really on a lot of public facing areas or private properties. Mostly we're doing it on Forest Service land or DNR land. So we're in the middle of the woods, and realistically we can just kind of cut it, let it lie. We have done treatments at sort of Island Park or the Besser Museum Nature Trail, where it's well, we don't really want to leave a bunch of brush around. So in that case, we either have to figure out where to put the brush, whether it's piling it, in the back corner where it's not in, an eyesore. And also is a good habitat for rabbits. We call it rabbitat when we make these nice brush piles. Or it can be, some people have the capability of wood chipping it or burning it, or some things can be composted, depends on the species. But yeah, a lot of times if we're in a very natural setting, having them just lay where they fall is not really detrimental to the habitat. If it's going to be an eyesore, we try to work with whatever landowner it is to figure out the best method for. If you were to cut them while they have fruit and the fruit got all in the ground, they might grow, but in terms of, sometimes that's just the only way. You already got autumn olive on your property. If you get a few more berries that germinate, it's not really, you can pull them out because they're little and they're young. So kind of just have to monitor and make sure you're catching them when they start growing. And that tree has probably been leaving berries on the ground or feeding them to birds who spread them for years anyways. So a few extra isn't gonna hurt too much beyond that. Huron Pines does lots of different habitat restoration projects. So these photos showcase the byproducts of our native seed program, which I could spend lots of time talking about that. But essentially, we work with different agencies and groups to collect seed from native plants in our region. The benefit of collecting, sorry, I keep hitting my mic. The benefit of collecting seeds from native species that are already in Northeast Michigan is that they're adapted to our climate. We know that they will probably do well in a similar area compared to if we were to buy seed from like Missouri. I don't know how well they would do when they're experiencing like our cold winters comparatively or things like that. But anyways, we collect lots of native seed and then we can use them to put on the landscape and create more pollinator and wildlife habitat. So this is a photo of myself and some of my colleagues taking a bunch of native seed that we've collected from the region, mixing them up with a bunch of sand and some dirt so we can more evenly distribute the seed. And then we are going to take this big bucket and just hand disperse it across that sort of plowed area in the background. So we've done that at a lot of Forest Service properties, a few private properties, and some DNR land as well. And that's a program that we are really excited to continue. And I'll talk about some opportunities later this year where volunteers will be encouraged to help us with our native plant restoration. Some of the projects you may be familiar with in our Alpena area we are removing glossy buckthorn, which is a giant invasive shrub from Island Park. I'm going to replace the areas where we're removing it with some native plants. We have a planting scheduled for this October at Island Park in sort of the dune area to put some nice dune species there and improve some of the diversity of that part of the island. We are working with the city of Alpena to install a pollinator and a rain garden at Bayview Park, sort of next to where they're installing all the new like basketball courts and pickleball courts. We're working at Neglegon State Park to remove lots of different kinds of invasive species and to protect pitcher's thistle habitat. Pitcher's thistle is a federally threatened plant species that grows on the shorelines of the Great Lakes and nowhere else in the world. And I could probably spend a whole hour talking just about pitcher's thistle too. But anyways, we want to make sure that federally threatened species is protected. And by removing some of the invasive species, we can prevent them from encroaching on the nice dune habitat that the pitcher's thistle needs to survive. We have North Point Nature Preserve and Birdsong Bay, Huron Pines is the owner of. So we're doing invasive species removal and threatened and endangered species monitoring at those locations. And we're also hoping to do some work at Partridge Point, which is owned by the DNR largely, to do some invasive species removal and hopefully some plantings in the future. That sort of just scratches the surface of some of our projects, but ones that are locally relevant that I thought would be beneficial to share. So you may be asking yourself, how can you help? And there's just a few takeaway items that I like to tell folks. Avoid planting invasive species. Surprisingly, many invasive species are commercially available. If you pick up any wildflower seed mix from a Walmart, a Menards, a wherever you are, the number one ingredient is often baby's breath, which in some parts of the United States may not be as invasive, but definitely not native. And for our Great Lakes habitat, they really like invading shorelines. Similarly, there's lots of other species that sort of you can buy at the store, but I would probably not recommend. So this book talks about invasive species and some native alternatives that you could plant on your property instead. And I really like that booklet. And we have a digital copy too, if you ever want it in a digital format. So yeah, if you can avoid planting invasive species, that'll save yourself a lot of problems in the future. And it saves me a lot of problems in the future too, because I won't have to deal with it. A lot of times you can do some involvement with your community or on your property to manage invasive species. If we're removing, let's just say autumn olive is a good example, from a nature park and the neighbors are starting to remove it from the places adjacent to the park, we're making a bigger impact on the landscape. We're keeping that area nice together, and it will reduce the likelihood that autumn olive or whatever the invasive species is will come back from a neighboring property if you can get a lot of people involved, which is nice. And even just going to your local park, if you see some garlic mustard, you can decide to pull it, come back in with a bag and some gloves, that sort of thing. We also offer lots of volunteer opportunities as Huron Pines, and there's lots of other great organizations in northern Michigan in general that do sort of these volunteer events. And if you maybe are like, I don't know how I feel about invasive species, but you just like nature in general, Huron Pines offers lots of other different events that cater to a broad interest level of lots of different nature related things. So, and then I work a lot with master gardeners or just really educated folks or groups that are really interested in invasive species, and just sharing that knowledge with others. Like if you're going fishing with your buddies, say, hey, you should clean your boat off before we go to another lake. That makes a big impact if they add up over time. So just even sharing your knowledge with others is really helpful for our grand big picture. So yeah, that's pretty much it for in terms of invasive species content. I just wanted to highlight a few of our upcoming events. I won't talk through every single, I thought I updated. I downloaded it before I updated. I was supposed to talk during the ice storm, but then the ice storm came, so that my event slide's a little outdated, unfortunately. But if you go to huronpines.org/events, you'll find all of our upcoming events there. And then I just want to say thanks for having me. I really enjoy talking with different groups about all sorts of topics, especially invasive species. And just want to point out that Huron Pines is a nonprofit organization, and donor contributions really help us make a bigger impact on the landscape. Thanks for having me. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
We're pretty much now out of our area.
I don't think it's gone. I think it's just sort of waiting for adult ash trees. They need to be a certain diameter before the ash borer benefits from using them. So I think right now we're just not seeing it because there's not very many big enough ash trees. But if the ash were to make a comeback, it wouldn't surprise me if the emerald ash borer came with them. Yes. There's a lot of old swamps that you can see that were all ash at one point in time that are just now standing dead.
Picture out right at the bottom there.
That's at Cheboygan State Park, I believe. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They consider invasive species because they just travel all over. All the time digging them up with a deadline.
That's a great question. I think that they are definitely non-native, but I don't know if they're quite considered invasive. If they are, they would be a very low on the priority list, but they do cause harm and are not native. So I think they do. So they are definitely a nuisance. I'm sure the state wouldn't do anything about them, but you're welcome to do something about them. Yep, just keep going down the line. Yep, I do that with baby's breath. Yes. We treat Phragmites, and we have found a few baby's breath out there, but I think we're pretty much have eradicated that, thankfully, with a few dedicated trips with shovels. And there is purple loosestrife out in sort of an area that's not super accessible that's very marshy. So, but mostly on the shorelines, we're trying to get rid of a few stems of Phragmites here and there. Overall, it looks pretty good in the grand scheme of invasive species.
States from Norway.
Mhm.
So when you move to Alpena.
Mhm.
Wisconsin, here, and they just go like crazy.
It depends on the species. There is one specific species of hops that I believe, it's not on the DNR's official watch list, but it is one that different organizations are concerned about. They found it like in the UP. It's very sporadic. So depending on what species you have, maybe, but not all hops are necessarily invasive, and it depends. Yeah.
Rather than all take the glancing and then some people glancing would put them to Detroit.
That's cool.
Beer, several different flavors.
Wow, that's awesome. Yes.
How about like oak?
Oak wilt.
And then there's a spruce,
Spruce budworm.
yeah, those are.
Yes, there is a big concern with oak wilt, especially after the ice storm, because a lot of trees were wounded. It is prevalent in sort of different pockets in our area. Like I know oak wilt is particularly bad in like Alcona County. And we've had it historically on like our Hubbard Lake Preserve, but we managed it quickly enough that it wasn't able to spread super broadly on our preserve, which is mostly oaks and red pine there. The best thing to do for oak wilt is preventative action. Don't cut or trim your oak trees from April to, it depends, like August, July, August, September sort of time frame. So like that peak summer, don't cut or trim your maple trees. Most of the time, the oak wilt is spread by beetles that visit the wounds because they like to eat the sap, and they have the spores of the fungus on them. And that's usually how it gets transported as wounds. There's also, if you really had to trim your trees for like utility purposes or like emergency scenarios, you can cover the wounds with, I don't know what it's called, but essentially it just covers them, yes, so that the wounds aren't open. So if the beetles with the fungus did come, they wouldn't, it'd be much less likely they would transmit oak wilt in those scenarios. There's also like, if you did already have oak wilt, it's a very intensive treatment regime. You have like a vibratory plow that severs all the root connections underground for X amount of feet based on the size of your tree. It's very intensive. I don't do that, but the DNR has vibratory plows. So if it were to occur on state land, that would be hopefully something they could address. And there's certain fungicides you can inject within the trees to keep them. It won't keep the oak wilt away, but it'll keep them from dying of oak wilt if you do it annually until you can find an alternative, more long-term treatment option. And then I don't know much about spruce budworm, to be honest, but I know it's a pest that affects the spruce in our area.
Why golf course?
Yeah, I would imagine that would require an insecticide. A lot of other tree pests are managed by injecting the tree with an insecticide, but that only works if the insects are actively feeding on the tree. So like there's a species called hemlock woolly adelgid that's prevalent on the west coast on Lake Michigan in a lot of those counties, and they will inject the trees that are infected with the insecticide. Then the insects feed on the sap of the trees, intake the insecticide, and then die. But it's very expensive usually, and you need the right equipment and training. I mean, the other alternative is like, yeah, you'd have to maybe cut down all the trees and burn them, and like hopefully they didn't spread while you were doing that activity. Yeah, it would be, yeah, it's very expensive usually.
Have you made a presentation to the Hubbard Lake Sportsman's Club?
I don't think I personally have. Maybe years ago somebody may have, but I never have. But if that's something you're interested in, I have business cards that you can take.
We tried a lot of things out in Hubbard Lake, mostly in the water problems, but around the lake also. Red mining and things. So I'm not sure where they are now. Find a industry group doing that with Huron Pines. So it's a good presentation.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
So I downloaded that app.
Yeah, missing.
And I was really surprised by some of the plants in my yard that are invasive species. Never knew, 'cause I went to a garden center. I'm just wondering, how do I dispose of them so that they
Don't spread.
don't spread?
Yes. Most of the time, the best action that is the least likely to spread them is to remove them, put them in a heavy duty black garbage bag, and then put another, like double bag it. So, and then let it. Yes. Yes. So in an ideal world, if you could double bag them, let them dry out in the sun for a couple days and then put them in a landfill, that's the most ideal. In the case of burning bush, you could probably remove them and like burn them if you have the capability to do that. I know a lot of people who live in the city can't burn things, but that's sort of like the next best option. It doesn't work for every species, but for burning bush, as long as you weren't like, yeah, I think like cutting it, drying it out, burning it would probably be the best bet. And then you may just have to watch to see if you were to leave some of the roots in the ground, just monitor to see if it grows back or, yeah, just takes, yeah, I know, I don't like burning bush very much either. We don't see that one a lot out in nature though, at least. They are pretty, I will give them that. Lots of invasive species are nice looking.
Sure. Well, I used to like a ornamental bush. And I don't know the name of this, but it grows wild. It grows wild, but you can contain it. Has berries and stuff. I don't know what it's called. And so burning bush is not a.
Burning bush is
Yeah, it is an invasive species. Japanese barberry is invasive. Another common landscaping bushes are privet. Privets are invasive. Lilac, I think, is typically falls more in the non-native category. It can grow very aggressively, but I don't really like see it spreading like wide scale. Usually it's just spreading on the property that it exists on. I've never seen it like in the middle of the woods in any of the places I've gone to, but it is a nuisance in my opinion. It grows like a weed. So, but it is pretty. They are. There's certain ones I choose to like, I'm like, okay, you're nice, and you know, in the grand scheme of things, you're not the worst one, so we'll give you a pass for in this, you know. Yeah.
Doesn't spread it.
Right. No, I don't see it spread like, yeah, like I said, it mostly spreads like very locally, like if you're have it on your property, you might see it spread a lot, but it doesn't jump around like a lot of other things do. Yeah, and if you're like maintaining them, that also keeps them from, you know, spreading around your own property too, like, so.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.